All right. 2 people, 3 chairs. Curious, right? This is Congresswoman Chellie Pingree from Maine. Local food champion, organic farmer, really a strong voice in Congress for the issue on wasted food and trying to do something about it. So I think she's no stranger to this crowd. We will soon be joined by Congressman Newhouse, you see in your program. He's caught in traffic. He and his staff are struggling to get across town, and so at some point he's just going to walk on stage and join us. So I want to start with the first question, Congresswoman, and that is, there's a lot going on in your district on local, and I've been up in Maine with you and I've seen it. So I'm wondering, is there something that you've seen recently in your district that excites you? I mean, I know it's hard to, I'm not saying pick favorites, but what do we want, what's some news from the field in Maine that we could learn from?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things is this whole relationship of the consumer to the farmer, which has really come closer and closer together, whether it's through farm stands or farmers markets, CSAs, just the number of ways that consumers are accessing food directly from the farm. And what I think is really exciting is, of course, in Maine, we have a lot of young farmers who have decided to get into farming, but also a lot of family farms that have found some way to either do a value-added product or a different method of marketing that has made their farm more financially viable and given them kind of hope for the future. Cheese making is one of those ways. We had a lot of dairies in Maine, and now we have 87 licensed cheesemakers. Some of them were there before, but a lot of them are part of our interest now in, locally grown and then locally made cheeses. And so some of them have benefited from the value-added producer grants, which are really a big help if you're trying to make that leap from traditional dairy, waiting for the milk to be picked up, to how do I have a certified little creamery on my spot. And I just think there's just a lot of ideas going on like that. Sometimes it's the next member of the next generation of the family who said, hey, we can make this farm, a little more commercially viable if we add this cheese production or we change our market. So, I mean, there's just a lot of creativity and a lot of excitement, I think, in people figuring out new ways to frankly, just make a better living at it.
Young people? You've seen young people in the local movement?
I would say mostly young people. I mean, we're one of the few states in the country where the average age is kind of going down, as opposed to, everyone's worried about farmers aging out or stable and just going down a bit. We have, I think, twice the number of young women getting into farming today as the average around the country. And these just, new young farmers are bringing in technology, creativity, better understanding of how to market, better understanding of what the consumers are interested in. Sometimes it's the next generation of a family, of a farming family, but a lot of them are just newcomers. Kids who grew up in Maine, went to an Ivy League college, decided to come back. I mean, it's really interesting, but huge influx of young people.
Wow. So consumer demand for local is growing, and we heard from some major retailers yesterday that this is not a fad, it's not a trend.
Great.
It is really here to stay. They haven't seen anything like it. It's growing leaps and bounds. So as you look at your district broadly, what opportunities do you see opening up as a result of the surge in this demand? Mr. Congressman,
hello.
How are you? Thanks for coming.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you. Good morning. Good.
So I've already mentioned that you were caught in traffic and we just started. And here I am. I have 2 congresspeople, which is great, 2 great leaders in Congress. But I also have a former commissioner of agriculture in the great state of Washington and an organic farmer. So these are not just, your everyday Congress people. These are people who are deep into our world. And so it's very exciting to have you here. We started top of the day with a great video from your state.
I was told I missed that.
You missed that.
You're going to play it again, right?
It looked really good, though.
And Chellie, I'm going to stop on that question here. I'm just going to go to Congressman Newhouse and ask if there's something. I mean, your district and your state has a lot of stuff going on about local and regional.
We do.
You have a lot. Is there anything that you want to share with the crowd, something that you've seen recently that excites you or interests you? We're trying to get a little sense of what's going on in your state. What should we know?
Oh my gosh, there's a lot of things that are exciting that are going on in the state of Washington, obviously. And you saw the video that I missed, but
We're going to send it to you.
okay, good. Well, first of all, Washington, a lot of people don't probably think of Washington as such an agricultural state, but it truly is. I live in the Yakima Valley, and a lot of times I describe it for people as being a miniature San Joaquin Valley. We raise almost anything you can think of in the state of Washington, except for citrus, those kinds of things where it needs a more moderate climate. But from A to Z, we have all kinds of different products. Over 300 crops are grown commercially in the state of Washington. Wow. And so it's very diverse. Agriculture is, compared to other segments of the economy, it's equal to the aerospace industry. And so those are the two leading industries in our state. So it's a big deal. And so there's a lot of exciting things happening. Probably two things come to mind though, Kathleen. I can probably count within about a 3-mile radius of where I live, and I live on our farm, maybe 4 miles, of at least 6 small farmers that are getting started on a couple acres of ground that are producing for farmers markets around the state. And these are typically Hispanic people that work at another farm and then work their own piece of ground when they have time, which is just the beginning of a new enterprise for them. And you see that all over. And I think that's in response to the demand that we're seeing around the state of all the different farmers markets that are springing up in almost every community, which is really exciting. How many of you have ever heard of Pike Place Market in Seattle, right? Where they throw the fish and all that kind of stuff? Well, I just heard just the other day that a community in my district, in Pasco, Washington, which is almost 200 miles from Seattle, inland, is looking to start a public market similar to Pike Place. And so it'd be right on the banks of the Columbia River. It'll be a great opportunity for these small farmers and local producers to connect with the consumer directly. So those are a couple things that are really exciting going on.
Well, that's great. I hope that takes off. Now, I was just asking Congresswoman Pingree, yesterday we heard from Whole Foods Market leadership and others that this local regional thing, it's not going away. It's not a fad, short-term thing. Mm-hmm. Consumer demand is just growing leaps and bounds. So. But from where the two of you sit, what do you see some of the obstacles being? Is it all smooth sailing, or are there some things that we really need to tackle to make this work better?
Me first?
Sure.
No. Oh, sure. I mean, there are plenty of obstacles. I think a couple of them are, we have a lot of the same kind of small farms. People get established, they do really well selling to a farmer's market, or they start their own CSA, and then you get a certain concentration of farms in a community, and they want to grow to the next size. They want to be a medium-sized farm. They want to maybe leave their other job and do this full time. Well, then I think we're all sort of plagued by the lack of assistance with distribution, food, aggregation hubs, people who can get what you're growing to a little more distant market, processing things when you have too much, when the season is too much. Maine used to be a very agricultural state, so we lost a lot of our agricultural production when the Midwest sort of became where everything was grown. And now that we're coming back again, we don't have the things that we used to have. I mean, there used to be a cannery in every small town. People canned corn, squash, beans. I mean, everything could be processed somewhere. Slaughterhouses, huge issue for us. People love to buy, grass-fed beef that is grown down the road, but to grow that beef, I have a small farm, you grow it, then you have to take it to a slaughterhouse maybe 2 or 3 hours away. Some people take their stuff out of state in Maine, and you have to find one, ours is organic, so you have to find one that's certified organic. I mean, it's complicated. You no longer can just, take the cow out in the barn and do it yourself and package it up and give it to somebody. You have to be at a slaughterhouse, and there's a lot of restrictions. So I think the infrastructure is a big challenge, and then also just helping to turn yourself into a medium-sized farm, because every step along the way, you have to figure out how to make money, and the price has to still be good. And it's one thing when you're selling off the farm and you get the retail price, day one. You get into a wholesale market, you got different pricing. I think that's a big challenge, and we've lost a lot of what we once had. And there are, certain kinds of assistance to bring it back, but not enough and not fast enough.
Yeah, they have to be USDA certified, right?
Yeah.
The slaughterhouses. Well, certainly there's a lot of challenges in agriculture. In our area, you wouldn't think so, but the state of Washington, I live on the dry side of the state, so water is a big limiting factor. The availability of irrigation water, the cost of land, the availability of credit, all those things impact small, medium, and large size farmers. But there's a couple things that are particularly challenging for farmers in general, but small farmers. One is a really difficult nut to crack, so to speak, and that's just the access to the consumer, access to markets. There's certainly the kinds of availability. The availability of markets is growing, but in order to be able to sell a large quantity of any product, farmers markets may be a great option, but it's not. It's kind of limiting too. You have to be able to access the larger consumer. So that's a limiting factor. And another thing, I think I heard you touch on this while I was getting mic'd up. I think the biggest limiting factor we have is actually people. That's the challenge. Not only I'm a farmer myself, and I don't like to be referred to as being aging out, but I guess that's probably the reality. The challenges of farming are becoming greater all the time. And even though I think we want the smaller farmers to exist, we like that interaction and be able to know your producer, the cost and the time consumed in meeting all the regulatory requirements, you can spend, and I can tell you firsthand, you can spend your whole day doing nothing that actually contributes to growing your crop. You're inside, filling out forms or paperwork and responding to different kinds of regulatory kinds of requirements. And that's a struggle. You don't have an HR department or a payroll department. You wear all those hats as a small farmer. And so if we want to preserve a small farmer, and I don't think everybody wants to see, the big corporate farm be the only, even though they're not all bad, I wouldn't say, but you don't want that as your only source of food. We have to keep that in mind to make sure that we can preserve a climate so small entrepreneurs can survive.
I'm going to go right back at you. I'll start with you this time. You mentioned water, and that just made my mind skip over to other kinds of beverages. And so that's just how an Irish girl's mind works. So
I like the way you're thinking.
So the name of this convening is the Local Foods Impact Conference. And I want to think about local beverages. So you've both been involved in work around the growing market for local craft beer. What are the challenges and opportunities you're seeing in your districts related to this, up and coming industry? What's needed to help address those challenges? So it's the beer question. I know it's a little early in the morning, but it's an important industry.
Well, being a hop farmer, I'm not sure.
It's never too early.
Yeah, it's never. Guinness goes good on cornflakes, I'm told, but I don't know that. So, being, like I said, growing hops my whole life, I've just really been delighted to see the increased popularity of beer in the United States and around the world. I'm sure I can't tell you the exact number, but I believe we have more breweries in America than we did before Prohibition took place. Wow. Just think of your local area. There's a brewery almost in every community, which is, as a hop farmer, that's just music to my ears, right? But they're small businesses just like any other Main Street business. And I guess challenges that we have to keep in mind are just kind of what I was referring to for small farmers as well. Making sure that these small businesses can be successful in an ever-increasing world of regulatory requirements that take just a lot of resources and a lot of time away from actually doing your business. And so I know that's a balance. A lot of those things are necessary and required, but I think we as lawmakers need to be cognizant of small businesses and the challenges they face. So I would focus on that.
Okay. Chellie, you have any?
And you're the co-chair of the Brewers Caucus, right?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, which is a very popular congressional caucus. Everyone comes to the receptions.
I'm starting to get a reputation.
Yeah. So I'm just a lowly member of the Brewers Caucus, not the co-chair. But Maine, again, it's one of these great Renaissance, activities that's going on. In fact, we just had a brew summit in our state this past weekend, and we had brewers from mostly New England, but all over the country, upstate New York. We had some hops farmers come in and talk to us about it, and it's just really exciting to see the impact it's having on both people's interests. It's big for us because people come and do beer tourism now. We have beer trips that people come and take. Portland, Maine, I represent, is a very popular eating spot, but also breweries have had an impact. I think as of the conference, there were 90 new small craft breweries in our state. I mean, new, some of them are 20 years old, but most of them new. And we kind of joke that every week you turn around and there's a new one in a small town. I live on an island off the coast of Maine, and we had a brewery open up just this winter. And we only have 350 residents who are doing a very good job sampling the beer all winter long. But a lot of our brewers are really excited to use more locally grown products. So hops has mostly moved out to the West Coast because I think there was a blight in the 1900s, and that really has become the center of hops. But we have a few starting hops farmers trying to figure out how to do what's a very, very complicated part of agriculture and requires a lot of skill. And so we're trying to support more research into hops varieties that would be good on all coasts and everywhere else. People are interested in buying local barley and malt. So much of it is accessed from Canada or other places. So we have barley farmers up in Aroostook County in northern Maine. But there's a lot to it, making sure you get the right grade and have the right machines. Malting itself is like developing fine wines. You have to be very skilled. Right. So we have two businesses now that are starting in the malt business. But one of our biggest breweries, Allagash Brewery, is making a beer called 16 Counties that they're marketing around the country with all of their other great beers, but they barely have enough product to make this 16 counties. It's saying we have 16 counties in our state, and the stuff comes from all of our state, but it's almost impossible to get enough product to do that. So, I mean, that's a challenge. The thing is, I think people used to kind of say, well, that's all nice, but it's just beer. Well, now in our state, it's a $400 million business, which is about equal to the lobster fishing industry. So you all know about Maine lobster, and that's an important part both culturally and economically. But this is just saying it has a huge impact. And the thing I just have to say, when I was at the Brewers Conference and giving them a little toast, trying some beers, giving a little toast, and I said, it's really exciting to look out a room full of people, many of whom are guys with beards and plaid shirts who are revitalizing our economy. And, we no longer have to look to Wall Street for this. We can just look right out there. And I think 20% of the new brewers are women, too, so it's great. But it's exciting.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to have you put up Pigeonhole for me, but I'm going to ask one last question of you two first, then we'll get something from the audience. You're both engaged in the issue of wasted food. And I know this is a national conversation that we have to have. And I would just like each of you just briefly say a little bit about that issue, what you're thinking about, what's important, what's on the agenda. That'd be great.
There's our bill.
Yeah.
That we're co-sponsors. We're trying to approach that, looking for ways legislatively that we can help reduce the amount of food that's wasted. I can tell you from experience firsthand that there's a lot of fruit, for instance, that maybe isn't quite as good as the one next to it, and so it gets left behind. But it tastes and is, perfectly good for you. So we've introduced some legislation along with a couple other members of Congress to improve the ability for farmers to be able to engage in allowing people to take advantage of some of that food that otherwise would just go to the birds or fall to the ground. reduce some of the liability issues of having people on your farm and those kinds of things. That it really is a shame that that's the case today. That so much food is grown. You know, all the inputs go into producing this food, and if it's not picture perfect, it doesn't get utilized, and that's something that we're trying to change.
Yeah, there's so many ways to go about it, and I think it's wonderful in the last couple of years you've seen this growing awareness on the part of the public, on the part of journalists, just hearing a lot about the fact that we waste about 40% of the food in this country, which is unthinkable when we have so many people going hungry. Food banks are always running out of food. There's just so many reasons we shouldn't be doing that. And so we've been trying to look at a comprehensive approach of making it easier for farmers to donate, easier for retailers to donate, making sure date labels are accurate enough so that you know what to throw away and not throw away. There's just a whole lot of ways to go about it, but I think it's good to see that there's a growing awareness, because sometimes that's what it takes, is once people get it into their head, they say, oh, well, maybe I can use this, or, supermarkets are selling sort of uglier seconds in fruit, and you say, well, that's probably just as good, or just all these changes we need to go through, and especially when you think about this resource issue. I don't live in a state that has a water shortage, but if we're wasting 40% of our food, think how much water we're wasting. And then the transportation costs of bringing the food from the West Coast to the East Coast, and then it still goes bad. I mean, there's just so many reasons this is a bad idea, and I'm glad it's getting a focus.
Yeah, well, good luck getting that across the finish line, your legislation. We thank you for your leadership on that. So these bouncing questions all over the place, and we'll share with you all the questions that come in, and they help shape our report, but some of the top vote-getting questions, so to speak, are really about the theme of this conference, which is metrics. And so the crowd wants to know, you're members of Congress and legislation comes up, appropriators, decisions have to be made. What kind of metrics do you think are convincing to Congress around local food investments? What helps you when you're talking to your colleagues about whether to invest in this, that, or the other thing? What makes a compelling case? What are the, and in fact, we may not be able to, maybe you want to share with the crowd, this is the kind of data I wish I had. But any thoughts on that? It's an easy question.
Yeah. Well, I'll start. First thing that comes to mind, I live in a rural area. The largest city in my district is less than 100,000 people. And I never really understood what a food desert was, even though we have to drive 6 miles to a grocery store. I never felt that was a big obstacle. We were just used to it. Until I came to Washington, D.C. In the neighborhood I live in here, it's about, I think Googling, it's about 1.2 miles to a grocery store, which isn't a big deal unless you don't have a car, right? So how do you get to the grocery store and back, packing all the stuff you need? People figure that out. I haven't gone to the little cart you pull behind you yet, but living in an area that it's not easy to get to the vegetable section of the supermarket or anything but a small convenience store, that's a real issue. And I think those kinds of things that help people understand the challenges that many Americans face in getting a healthy diet in front of their families. That's one thing that comes to mind, and maybe in a conversation, more things.
Well, I'm a solid believer in the impact of locally grown foods on our economy. And coming from a state where I've really been able to see the changes, I first got into agriculture over 40 years ago, so I've just seen a huge change in the interest people have in accessing local food and the interest of tourists coming in, and which is our largest industry, tourism. So, but the thing is, it is hard to have good facts and figures. I can get passionate and try to convince my colleagues on the committee, but having numbers that say, this is the economic impact that purchasing locally is now having. This is the percentage of, grocery stores that are now that they're devoting to a local food section or whatever. I don't. You guys are the statistician and researchers and people who understand better how to derive the figures. But I do think we need an economic measure, because I think it's it's very hard especially in the Washington world where you're composing a farm bill or you're deciding what to fund, and people's focus tends to be on the commodities, on the big agricultural states, on the impact that the dairy industry has, or soybeans or other things, and you want to say, no, this is how it's transforming the rural economy in my state, and this is the economic impact it's having on a number of new farmers who have found markets, or the interest in consumers. I'd have to think more about exactly the data, but I do think we have a shortage of data, and I think it creates a challenge because this still looks like a little bit of a marginalized, boutique-ish, misunderstood part of the growing of the growth in American agriculture, and particularly because there are other places where people are challenged to get, good prices or make the farm pay. And, your example was a good one. People who are working on farms who are starting in this little way, and the way they're finding access is through selling to a local market. They wouldn't be able to do that if they were just, raising tomatoes and it was going to a wholesaler,
All right, well, I'm getting the blinking red light, so I know that's our time, but I just want to thank you both and turn one of the questions that's come from the audience into a big old thank you too. How do we make American agriculture the national priority it deserves to be? And I just want to thank you both for your voices in Congress, your leadership, and trying to do just that. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our Congresspeople. Thank you.
Thank you.